So this is Karante Yamashita. I think most of you know her. And I'm Bettina Aptaker. And so we have been the co-chairs of the UC Presidential Chair in Feminist Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. And on behalf of that co-chair, we both want to welcome you here tonight. And we want to welcome Samuel Delany to the UCSC campus, and appreciation to him. So I've been tasked this evening, we're both going to make a few opening remarks, and I was asked to say a few things about the presidential chair. These are the last months in which it will exist in this form. It was an award that was made in 2012. It was supposed to last for 3 years, and we stretched the funding to 4 years, and it will end on June 30th. I think it's fair to say that we have loved working together. I think that's right. And I've loved working with Karante, I'll put it that way. And we feel privileged to have worked with so many colleagues and students and staff to initiate programs and classes, special events such as this one, poetry readings and film screenings. Our intention has been to deepen understandings of feminist critical race and ethnic studies, to support the creation of the program in critical race and ethnic studies, and to encourage wider understanding of these issues that are so important to the intellectual life of the campus and the democratic and radical aspirations of the country. I wanted to say some things that we have sponsored, the things that we have done. For example, we sponsored a course on Native American women writers. We have brought scholar activists to the campus like Angela Davis for a graduate seminar and a lecture in a CRESS core course. We brought Ruthie Wilson Gilmore to the campus, who's the author of Golden Gulag, which was a pioneering study on the prison industrial complex in California, and many, many other folks that we've been able to bring to the campus. Very recently, we sponsored the Nigerian filmmaker Branwyn Akpako and included a screening of her film, The Education of Alma Obama, at the Nickelodeon Theater downtown. We've held colloquium, for example, on gender, region, and slavery, and another on bodies of knowledge in the Japanese Empire. We sponsored conferences such as the two-day one last year honoring the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, whose book Borderlands La Frontera inspired generations of scholars and inaugurated a whole new field called border studies. We have also sponsored major public events such as the one following Arab Spring with Egyptian feminist Jihan Abu Zaid. Last year, we brought Anita Hill to UCSC, highlighting the issues of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and racism. Some of you were probably there. She spoke to a crowd approximating 1,000 people on this campus, and you know there's no room that's large enough. So we had one room full, and we simulcasted it to another room, in fact, 2 other rooms, and it was broadcast live on KZSC radio. This is a partial listing of our initiatives and events, and you can see from it our feminist, queer, anti-racist, transnational global agenda. Tonight's event with Samuel Delany is one of those extraordinary moments in the life of a campus, and we are thrilled for it. And I just want to say a couple of things about CRESS, Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. It is now a major at UCSC, but it became a major after a long visionary struggle by graduate and undergraduate students of color, with support from allied faculty and students. There have been 2 searches to hire faculty for this program. One concluded last year, resulted in the hire of Nick Mitchell, who is in feminist studies, and another is in progress, and we expect to know the results of that search by the end of this academic year. In addition, faculty in feminist studies and many other departments teach classes that may be applied to the CRESS major. Now, I'm rehearsing these details because I want you to understand that while we have made significant progress, we still have a long way to go. As a program, CRESS is currently housed through an ad hoc administrative unit called Interdisciplinary Studies. It is a program. It is not a department in its own right. I believe it needs to be a department, its own department, with its own self-governing faculty, and with the hiring of a critical mass of faculty committed solely to this field. I believe that CRES is important to the intellectual life of this campus as the Genome Project, Astrophysics Department, and Computer Engineering. I believe this for many reasons, but one of them is because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that racism and sexism, which I prefer to call misogyny, are foaming and churning in staggering ways in this UC presidential campaign. Donald Trump's rhetoric does not create the racism and misogyny. What his campaign does is to articulate in very hateful ways the bigotry that already exists. It gives license to its expression, sanctioning racist and sexist violence. Critical race and ethnic studies, emphasis on the word critical, which means the capacity to think, the capacity to analyze. Critical thinking is why we teach. To my mind, critical thinking also means the capacity to know suffering. And in knowing suffering, to open one's heart to it, to seek an end to it, to embrace one another, to hold life, all life, sacred. Critical thinking is at the heart of this presidential chair, and what Karen, Tay, and I have sought to bring to the campus in whatever modest and hopeful ways we could. Thank you.
Thank you. We have many people to thank tonight, but first I want to thank and recognize my co-chair, Bettina Apteker, with whom I have shared the responsibilities of this UC presidential chair for the past 4 years. Bettina, you've been my mentor and my teacher, my co-conspirator, and a great friend. And this work partnership has been one of the most satisfying jobs I've known at UC Santa Cruz. When we began this project, we didn't know what could happen and what kind of an impact we might make. But I think we similarly came to our responsibilities too, and this will sound archaic, but I'm getting old. I'll just say it. We came to our responsibilities to serve the people. To make the resources of our chair and its funding far-reaching across the campus and local community in these critical years when we have had to reckon with a continuing and growing divide between those who have and those who do not have. Those who are sheltered, cared for, educated, and protected with equal rights, and those who are not. We have had to reckon with the insidious and violent persistence of racial color and gender differences in determining those who have and those who do not have. In particular, for our project at UC Santa Cruz, we'd have had to reckon with public and political policies and the consequent institutional lag and blindedness. And by blindedness, I mean that which we cannot see, that which we choose not to see, and that which we must learn to see. These policies have reduced our resources, financial resources, but more significantly, diversely human resources to do the work that our public university is charged to do, to serve the people, to provide the critical skills, knowledge, creative thinking, the risks of innovation, to encourage a rich and fruitful intellectual life for all the people. For Bettina and me, this opportunity to try to shape a renewed vision and future for our university has been a very special gift. And I thank Bettina and all of you who have supported our efforts. This evening, we are grateful for the support of our principal donors, the Humanities Division and Dean Tyler Stovall, the Siegfried and Elizabeth Pucknat Literary Studies Endowment through the Literature Department, the UC Presidential Chair for Feminist Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, and the Chancellor's Office and Vice Chancellor Allison Galloway, who extended our funding for the 4th year. And there are many entities across the campus who contributed generously to this evening's event. And in alphabetical order, I'm going to name them all, and I hope I don't miss anyone. The Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center, the African American Resource and Cultural Center, the American Indian Resource Center, the Arts Division, the Center for Labor Studies, the Chicano Latino Research Center, College 8, El Centro, the Film and Digital Media Department and the Social Documentation Program, the Latin American Latino Studies Department, the Lori Sain Creative Writing Endowment, the Lionel Cantu Queer Center, the Literature Department and Creative Writing Program, Oaks College, the Politics Department, the Porter College George Hitchcock Poetry Endowment, and the South Asian Studies Initiative. Finally, we would like to thank the Bay Tree Bookstore and Christine Harper for selling Samuel Delany's books tonight. Also, the Literature Department and Heidi Flores for arranging Professor Delany's visit to Santa Cruz, and the Institute for Humanities Research, Evan Guy, Courtney Mahaney, Irina Polich, for the myriad planning, publicity, and scheduling, not only of Professor Delany's visit and event tonight, but for over 4 years, for these 4 years, for your excellent and careful organizing skills and budgeting talents. We are very grateful. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce Dean of Humanities and Distinguished Professor of History, Tyler Stovall. Dean Stovall joined UC Santa Cruz as Dean of Humanities last year in April. Prior to his appointment, he was Professor of French History and Dean of the Undergraduate Division of the College of Letters and Sciences at UC Berkeley. Dean Stovall is not new to our community at UC Santa Cruz. He has a long history with Santa Cruz as faculty member for 13 years, as chair of the History Department, and provost of Stevenson College. He has also taught at Ohio State University and at the Université de Polynésie Française in Tahiti. Okay. I have a Portuguese accent, I guess. Dean Stovall is the author of several books and numerous articles in modern French history, specializing in transnational history, labor, colonialism, and race. We are very honored, Dean Stovall, by your generous support of Samuel Delany's visit to UC Santa Cruz. And now please welcome Dean Tyler Stovall.
Thank you all. My sister's a disc jockey. She always told me to have the mic come to you. Thank you all for taking the time to come out for all of these events, and especially for tonight's event. I'm only going to speak very briefly because I know it's not me you came here to see. But I just wanted to say a few words to introduce our speaker and the kinds of things he is going to be talking about with us this evening. In thinking about Samuel R. Delany, I thought about the fact that in many ways, to grow up black in America is to grow up with a long list of things that black people are not supposed to do, places where black people are not supposed to go, jobs that black people are not supposed to have, mostly the good paying jobs, ideas that black people are not supposed to have, and things that they're not supposed to, forms of expression that they're not supposed to engage in. If any of you, for example, have had the chance to see the recent documentary by about the great jazz artist Nina Simone, has anybody seen this? Well, you may remember that Nina Simone originally wanted to be a black classical pianist, but was told that a black person could not be a classical musician. Well, one of the things on that list that black people are not supposed to do is write science fiction. This is something for Disney, I suppose, or other people, mostly white males, but not for black writers. About 20 years ago, a cultural critic named Mark Derry wrote a seminal article called Black to the Future, Afro-Futurism 101, in which he made the case for Afrofuturism and coined the term. And he argued 2 points in particular. First of all, that who was more suited to explore alternate worlds and explore different kinds of science fiction universes than African Americans, that African Americans were the original alien abductees. Secondly, he made the point that just as science fiction was in many ways marginalized as a literary genre, so were African Americans marginalized in American society. His article really launched the public idea of Afrofuturism as a literary genre. But it's worth noting that when he wrote this article in 1994, our guest this evening had already been writing in the genre for over 30 years. Samuel R. Delany was born and raised in New York, raised in Harlem, and then as a young man, settled in, I could say settled in the East Village, but it would be more accurate to say that he settled in Lower Manhattan and then with many other people created what became known as the East Village. He published his first novel, The Jewels of Aptor, at the age of 19. He went on to publish many more science fiction novels, including many that you've seen for sale, Babel 17 in 1966, Dahlgren in 1975, and my favorite, the 4-volume Return to Neveryan series in the 1970s and 1980s. He is the winner of numerous awards in the field of science fiction. He has won 2 Hugo Awards and 4 Nebula Awards. In 2002, he was inducted into the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. In 2013, he was named Science Fiction Writer of America's 30th Grand Master. His many themes of mythology, memory, language, sexuality have made him a one-of-a-kind writer in not only just the realm of science fiction, but in the realm of fiction in general. For many years, he served as professor of creative writing and English at Temple University, from which he recently retired. It is truly our great pleasure and privilege to have Samuel R. Delany come speak to us at UC Santa Cruz, and I hope you will all give him a warm and rousing welcome.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Bettina Abthecker and Karen Te Yamashita and Dean Tyler Stovall and Cress for having me here, as I want to thank you all for coming. The way I tend to do my readings is I will read for a little while, then we'll have some Q&A for a while if you have any questions. So think about what you might want to ask now before we actually put you on the spot and ask you for a question. Then after we've talked a few minutes for a while, maybe 20 or so minutes, if we can possibly get that much response from you, but I think maybe we can. Then there'll be another small reading, which will close things out, and that will be the program. One of the other things that Black people are not supposed to do is, if they do write in one genre like science fiction, they're not supposed to go and write in others. They're not supposed to write pornography. I do. They are not supposed to write literary fiction. I do, for better or for worse. They're not supposed, and people who write science fiction themselves are not supposed to win awards in literary fiction. And the book I'm going to read you from tonight is a book that, when it was published in 2007, won the Stonewall Book Award. And it's an award I'm very, very proud of. It's one of the awards I'm most proud of. It's the section, one of the reasons I am reading it is because it's going to be the next book of mine that's returned to print after it was published in 2007, and it will be published again at the end of this year by Dover Books. And I'm very pleased that that is happening. The book is called Dark Reflections. And Dark Reflections basically is about a gay black poet. I am not a gay black poet. I am a gay black prose writer. Arnold is very different from me in many ways, and I always stress the differences. Arnold is an adjunct professor on Staten Island. Arnold is unpartnered. I have been partnered from one person or another since I was 19 years old. Arnold has not had anything like the kind of career I have been very fortunate to have. Someone asked me during the signing today, where did you get the idea for Arnold? The idea was simply, over my life, I have met many, many black poets who have had the kind of life that Arnold had, not the kind of life that I had. And so I decided to write about him. The particular scene I'm going to read you the scene I'm going to read you, forgive me, is based on something that actually happened. It happened the Thursday before Christmas Eve in 1982. It's a reading that was given at the St. Mark's Church in the Bowery by Amiri Baraka. I went to a reading by Amiri Baraka on December 23rd, 1982. I thought it was fucking great. However, Arnold does not have the kind of response to it that I had. He has a very different response. From Dark Reflections. What was Arnold's relation to the black poetic tradition? On his East Village apartment shelves, treasured first editions of Haydn, Braithwaite, Bontemps, and Tolson leaned against the camp volumes of County Cullen, and Angelina Weld Grimke secretly enjoyed. He read and reread a 19th century edition of The Life of a Luda Equiano, written by himself, till the board backs were falling off, as he'd reread Beetle Creek and the Catacombs. The black arts poets, Larry Neal and Sonia Sanchez, were both heroes to Arnold, but he found a stridency, or perhaps better, a lyric self-involvement in Jones Baraka that not so much repelled him as bored him. He liked Baraka's freewheeling prose, though. The System of Dante's Hell, he had read the first part of it in Trembling Lamb, which he'd purchased in a very small Cambridge bookstore years before, when he'd gone with Aunt Bee to hear a Boston Pops concert. There was a close-up of Jean Harlow on its black matte cover. And Tales. Soon, though, he decided he didn't like the people who expressed the same opinion, so he stopped mentioning even those. Several years after he'd moved to New York, the Thursday before Christmas Eve, in his folding metal chair in the St. Mark's Church basement, Arnold had sat waiting They're coming in from Newark, someone said. The traffic's heavy. In the full, bright basement room, Arnold thought how the posters and flyers outside over the church gates for this local writing group and that one, this reading in this coffee shop or that bar, always made him uneasy. It's too many. Yes, Arnold thought, poetry should be for everyone, but a poetry project, as St. Mark's was called, sounded too much like public housing space in a housing project, financed by the state and open to everyone, skilled and unskilled, ignorant and learned. Writing poetry wasn't like deciding to join a social club. It was like deciding not to. And pretending it was seemed wrong. If somehow you managed to have enough money, you didn't apply for welfare. That was something Arnold had learned specifically from being black and from New England. If you could afford to live somewhere nice, you didn't apply for an apartment in the projects. Too many other people needed them all over the country, and too many of those were black. You were taking it away from your needy neighbors and friends, and often in Pittsfield and Boston, he'd known them. Sitting there waiting for the poet to arrive, it returned to him how, half a dozen years ago, in '76, when she had won the National Book Award, he'd gone to hear Hacker at the YMHA. After her reading, he'd gone up to tell her how much he'd liked what she read, and he asked her if she would ever come down and read at the Bowery Church. They never asked me. She'd been biting at her lip. In her slacks and her long hair and her glasses, she looked at him, possibly bitter, almost embarrassed. I don't think they like the kind of poetry that I write. He was surprised because he did so much. Then a taller woman, also with pale plastic-framed glasses, moved in to rescue her from him. Later, he'd said to Bobbie Horner at Pee Wee's, I wonder if it was just because I'm black and she didn't want to go on talking with me. What he meant was it because he was bumptious, over-enthusiastic, overweight, and clearly not from New York? But Bobbie went on to surprise him as much as she had. Maybe not. Her husband's black. How, he wondered, did Bobbie find such things out? Now he was thrown back to a reading he'd gone to at the Guggenheim, where Richard Howard had read. Even shyer of speaking, Arnold had asked the poet if he might ever come to the St. Mark's Poetry Project. Howard had smiled. He'd actually smiled at Arnold. Then he'd said, you go to different places to hear different kinds of poetry. Then, in his gray scarf, he'd hurried away to waiting friends. Was that, Arnold wondered, simply a politer way of saying the same thing as Hacker had? With its Lamont poetry selection and its NBA, Hacker's first book carried on the back a solid square of Howard's praise-filled prose. Could two poets write more differently than they did? Hacker wrote in rhyme. Howard wrote in an architected rectangular stanza assembled from the minutiae of literature, philosophy, and history. Then, in dashiki and brocaded fezzes, Baraka, since Brooks liked him, Arnold felt he had to give him a chance, and his entourage strode into the room, waving real guns and firing real blanks at the ceiling. At the first ear-deadening and echo-laden retort, one woman screamed. A second and a third shot crashed out. Several people laughed uncomfortably. Another up-tilted muzzle flashed silver in the fluorescent lights, spitting sparks and its shattering crack. And Arnold bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to make his eyes water. Blood seeped into his mouth. At the end, Everyone rose in a boisterous ovation while people clapped and cheered around him. Arnold stood slowly. He didn't want to stand. This wasn't poetry, he thought. He put one hand over his belly and patted its back, thinking, you have to read this stuff. How do you judge it in this way? And no real poet would want to. He took a breath, looked up, and heard people whistling and cheering. A few older people, he realized, wanted to get out of his aisle. 2 black women and an older white man in a suit, but they couldn't because of all the kids, still more whites, in these few aisles of seats than blacks, who were cheering. He wanted to sit down, but was afraid to. Suppose they thought he didn't like it. The whole thing had gotten too upsetting. People were milling at the door and beyond it. Finally, Arnold wedged out with the people into the basement lobby. Near the door out into the remains of the old graveyard was a bulletin board holding a shale of flyers and announcements. He made his way through the people walking or rushing, the first time he'd seen as many black faces here as white, toward a bulletin board with the shaling of thumbtacked announcements and notices on yellow, pink, and green paper. I'd have known so much more about this had I seen it in the church in Pittsfield. Not that they'd ever invite a black beatnik poet at all. He stepped aside to let more people leave through the door. Someone cried out. He turned, and people were laughing. Beside him, a tall black woman had screeched and stumbled over the lower step to the second-floor restrooms. "Oh, I'm still so excited," she declared as one of her girlfriends steadied her. "I'm so excited." And then she'd stood up and begun to climb along with several others. Arnold didn't want to fight his way out until a few more people had gone. On orange paper, one announcement said, "Serious about your black power?" with an exhortation to meet at the apartment of someone named Hamlin in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Two others that caught his eye told of poetry groups in this neighborhood. What are they going to do here, he thought, read awful poems about black oppression, learn how to load guns with blanks? A hard hand hit heavily on Hawley's jacket shoulder. "Arnold?" He looked over. It was Bobbie. "So, what did you think?" Bobbie Horner. "It's just he couldn't articulate what he meant. Hey, after that, I want some enthusiasm, man." Bobbie laughed. "Not all your qualifications. Hey, you want to come for a drink?" Clearly, Bobbie had thought it was great. "You can tell me anyway, because I know you will." "No, I will." But Bobbie, off the hook at no, was gone before Arnold could explain he'd been so upset from biting his jaw he hadn't been able to listen for the first 20 minutes, and after that only caught a line here and there. "I should have just walked out," he said in the loud lobby where no one could hear. "That's what I should have done." Then he was glad Bobbie was gone, because that's not what he thought at all. What he thought was that he wanted to get up and go upstairs and rinse his mouth out in the men's room stained sink. But with people standing all over the lobby, once he left, he knew he'd never get back in. It was too crowded and too important to leave in the middle. He owed it to the community, the black community, to endure it. And what he'd gotten for his pains was a sore cheek, a pounding heart, and not an entire poem that he could take in from beginning to end and actually consider. There hadn't even been an intermission. It had been quick, exciting, and most of it because he'd been sitting on a hard chair with a mouthful of blood and saliva in the second to the last row he'd missed. Even with the other black guys who'd come with Baraka, striding up and down, and now and again repeating a line loudly that Baraka had declaimed. I can't even remember a title. Walking home across Tompkins Square, Arnold managed to create a dialogue he wished he'd been able to summon back with Bobbie. He could imagine himself, if he'd gone for that drink, at a side table over a pint mug. "Bobbie, what did you think of those poems this evening?" Then he would lean forward and shout, "Boo!" Bobbie would jerk back, surprised. Arnold's shout would have been audible even in the pre-holiday roar on Friday night. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Black men and white women would turn, frown, and look, and he would say, "It was all just pretend, Bobbie, just pretend." "That's not blood running out of your mouth, is it? Like the blood running out of mine? Don't worry. I was pretending, Miss Black Lady. I was pretending, Mr. White Man. I was only pretending, Bobbie. Why would a serious black poet be frightened or bleeding or firing shots at the ceiling? For who? So this old gun that only shoots blanks could watch the show? So y'all could have some fun? Come on, Bobbie. Now just think of it there in that holy old church basement as the new shuck and jive, because that's all it is, Bobbie, shuck and jive. And shuck and jive ain't what poetry's about, Bobbie, whether it's in your language or mine, Gwendolyn Brooks or Willie Shakespeare's. Poetry is what you think, and think is worth thinking. What you say and what you think is worth saying because you've played that way, you've played. When you're writing or reading a poem, you do it. You don't pretend. Arnold stalked through the night and stumbled on a cracked edge of paving. "Oh, Jesus," he thought, "am I still so excited? I feel sick. I'm scared." How would anyone, even a regular, get a table this hour, this close to Christmas? It was no more likely than someone coming out with a perfect speech, perfectly delivered, especially when they'd just been scared shitless with a mouthful of bloody spit. I didn't even hear the goddamn poems, he thought, and stalked on. I wanted to hear them, and I failed. I failed Baraka. I failed my community. I failed their community. I failed myself. I pretended to stand up. Pretended to applaud, pretended I was okay, pretended so nobody would know I didn't have any way to say anything about anything but the show because I was too scared to be there. How do you even write poetry around people, black, white, anything at all, who think this is what poetry is about? Scaring the life out of people, the death out of them? Probably that's what he thinks he's doing. Waking us up, scaring the death out of us. I've got to stay away from people like that. He stopped and put one hand on the gate running beside the night shrubbery up to the men's room wall. I'm so scared. He crossed in front of the building to continue beside the playground and handball courts. Two boys who couldn't care less about poetry or power, black or white, two Puerto Ricans, he was sure, were knocking the ball against the concrete wall with hollow thunks. Or maybe one of them was black and would someday rule the world. He walked with jacket unzipped, still shaken, his neck chilly, still tonguing torn flesh inside his mouth, and sometimes tasting blood. How, he wondered, after that, were you supposed to remember or even pay attention to the damn poems the poet happened to read? It says on the poster that I am a sex radical, an Afro-Futurist, and a grandmaster of science fiction. Do you have any questions about any of those areas? Yes, the gentleman in the second row there.
Thank you. Actually, I do have a question. Do you think that there are intersections between black religion and Afrofuturism? And if so, what might those be? And also, I love the Neverian series. Just was delightful. I wrote about it in my dissertation.
Well, thank you. Well, a lot of questions are religious. I mean, in fact, I don't think there's any question that doesn't eventually go back somewhere to, will we survive? Will we die? And that's fundamentally, or where did we come from before we were here? Where do we go once we are no longer here? That's a very religious question, and that's what a lot of these questions go back to. So in that sense, philosophy itself is an outgrowth of religion. All philosophy is an outgrowth of religion, and in that sense, the way culturally we as blacks have done certain things, it's inescapable. I don't think one of the other things that blacks are not supposed to be is atheists. I am an atheist. What can I say? And that's kind of the way I tend to answer, and have been one for a long time. I broke with the church when I was 13 in Harlem, and refused to to get my Episcopalian confirmation. And I had, I had a lot of very serious religious questions, and I went to the minister, Father Scott, and Father Bishop. He was the paradox of a black minister named Father Bishop. And I went and I said, I have some serious questions about religion. And they said, don't worry your head about things like that. Just forget about them. I said, no, I'm serious. I'm really worried about these things, and I want to talk to you about Father Scott, who is a very gentle and nice guy, took me to dinner at a very kind of seedy restaurant across on the other side of 7th Avenue, and I said, well, these are some of the things I'm worried about. I'm worried about, do you really think we will go to heaven or hell? Is this? And he said, don't worry about those those things. I decided I was not a Christian about a year later. That's what this black kid did on 132nd Street, between 132nd and 133rd, in 1955. That's how I played it. That seemed to be the most serious way to play it. I decided I wanted to be a Hindu. One of the reasons I wanted to be a Hindu is because I had heard that the Hindu religion accepted all religions. That they would accept all religions. Also, we had spent a year in school with a woman named Edith Mukherjee, who was the wife of a Hindu scholar named Dan Gopal Mukherjee, and we'd been studying the history of India and the history of China. It was a very strange school, but that's what we did, And I thought I had been given a better version of how to deal with this stuff than Father Scott and Father Bishop had given me when I'd gone and asked, what to do. So I just later, several years later, where in the church at the St. Mark's at the Bowery, I had, being a Hindu, of course, led to some of my positive feelings about Buddhism in general. That's kind of how it all worked. And I thought, with a whole lot of other people who were sitting on the floor at the Bowery Church, that Buddhism was probably a pretty good religion and certainly had things to recommend it over, over what I had been raised with. And a young man raised his hand. He was a Buddhist. He had been born a Buddhist. And he proceeded to tell us why Buddhism was the most evil religion in the world, because it made you accept all the injustices and what have you. It told you it's okay, and I thought, wait, this is not what I am supposed to be hearing. This is not what Buddhists are supposed to be saying, and the whole thing, it's a dialectical process. Religions don't solve problems. What they do is they make you ask questions against the grain. That's all they can do. And as you go through this, you just go through these differences. Okay, now, where has black religion gone in all this? I don't know. I really don't know. If you know, you're very lucky. You're very lucky. Hold on to it. If it supports you, if it gives you something, fine. It didn't give me anything growing up in Harlem at the time I did. Being a black man, my grandfather my grandfather was the vice chancellor of an Episcopalian college that still exists to this day, St. Augustine's, just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a very important institution. My grandfather was born a slave. Now, that's not my great-grandfather. That's, how many of you remember your own grandfathers? Okay, yeah, you remember your own grandfather. Well, my grandfather was a slave in this country. I never met him. He was dead before I was born. But the point is, he was that close in time to me. And it had a lot to do with who I became, and it had a lot to do with what I rebelled against. My grandfather, as I said, he was born a slave. He also learned how to read and write before emancipation took place. He was born in 1857 in Georgia. And he said many, many times that if his master had not grown bored and taken this bright little 6 or 7-year-old and taught him how to read early, he never would have learned. Because once emancipation came, he and his family were too busy trying to survive for him to learn. Now this is how these things work. There's a lot of not doing what you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to be doing, as Dean Stovall said, in order to get anything done. So this is how it works. I am talked about in that first article in Afrofuturism by white Mark Deary. Mark is a very interesting guy. There was a Facebook post by Mark Deary less than a week ago about my take on science fiction book covers. The point is, this is the way I handled, and I still, in a sense, handle Afrofuturism. What is Afrofuturism? I am because I am black. I grew up in this country as a black person, and I was the first science fiction writer to come up through the commercial field of science fiction in this country. So I am Afrofuturism, and my student Octavia Butler is Afrofuturism, and all the black people who write science fiction, who have come after us and who've come to do this, we are it. Don't you tell me that I am not Afrofuturism because I am not black enough. Don't you tell me that I didn't make myself black. You did. You white people. You are the people in this country who made me black. Because you decided that people with darker skins 300 years ago, were different. And that difference is what black people are. And I was made that way, not by, anything other than the response to that exclusion. the things that I had to do in order to deal with it. So that's what Afrofuturism is, and by the same token, that's what, in the same process produces the sex radical. And it also produces the grand master of science fiction. Okay? There you go. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions that anybody has? Yes, Eric. Pardon me?
I'd love to hear you talk.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
And I'd like to know, you just said, and that's what produces the sex radical. How does that produce the sex radical?
I'm glad you asked that, Eric. How are we doing how are we doing time-wise? What are we doing? Huh? Yeah, okay, fine. All right, that's about the time I need. Yeah. Huh? Oh, okay. Well then, in that case, Eric, I will put off answering your question for just for a few more minutes, if indeed there are other things that people would like to ask, either about science fiction per se or anything. I'll wing anything. I'm one of these guys that, yes, the gentleman up there. Yes. You. Don't look behind you. No, you.
Response, but my question was specifically about Afrofuturism.
Okay, sure.
And that is how it's necessarily handled in the larger culture surrounding, culture surrounding science fiction and its handling of race. My question is, do you feel like Afrofuturism is a way of subjecting Black narratives to teleological play?
It can be. Again, it's what the particular writer who has been labeled Black by the larger society feels like doing on Wednesday morning at 9:37, and decides to put down on the paper that day. That's what it is. If that's a story that appeals to teleological endings, fine. If it's not, that is totally open-ended and dialectically ambiguous, then that's what it is. That's how it works. It works the way writing itself works. It's not, as soon as you start saying what Afrofuturism should be, so that you can say, therefore, whatever this particular Black writer decides to write is not really Afrofuturism, you're joining the wrong side. You just are. I'm not saying don't criticize what a given writer writes. What a given writer writes about Blacks, whites, gays, men, women, whatever. You can certainly criticize. This is not saying that you don't criticize, but you criticize because you have reasons to criticize it. You don't like it. That's a good start. And it's one that I appeal to, again and again. If you have a reason to criticize it. But because it is teleological, if you make the teleology sound interesting, intelligent, clever, and the ends are ones that you want, if the telos involved is one that you're after, what's wrong with being teleological? If, however, it seems foreclosed and deadening and doesn't seem to be open enough and have, and doesn't, then the teleology just doesn't really work. That's how those things work. Sonnets end with pairs of, with a rhyme. With at least Shakespearean sonnets end with a couplet rhyming, which tends to close things off and give it a sense of an ending. Petrarchian sonnets end with ABC, ABC. The rhyme is kind of, and so they seem a little bit more open. They're both sonnets. That's one of the reasons why they're both sonnets, because the form is loose enough to cover both effects. And there are some people like Petrarch that do one very well, and there are some people like Shakespeare that do the other very well. That's how they work. One of the things that happened to me, just in my, again, it's not supposed to happen. How do you put this? In 1966, a writer named Thomas M. Dish, who is not with us, he killed himself in 2010. He wrote a novel called Camp Concentration. It's a very, very good and powerful novel. Tom was one of the whitest writers I ever met. He was white. He was so white. He was from the Midwest. Really, the Midwest. Anyway, he wrote this novel, and in the novel, one of the characters is a black character named Mordecai Jones. Mordecai Jones was the first black character written by a white writer I had ever read, and certainly in science fiction, that struck me as a black man as believable. And I said, Tom, how the fuck did you do that? How did you do that? And he said, well, I based him on a black kid I knew in school. And I gave him all the questions that it seemed to me, if I was a black kid in school, I would have been asking. And then he said something else. He said, I also realized I had to keep all sexuality out of it. Because if I did put the sexuality in, I knew Tom was also gay. Tom was also a gay man. And he said, if I did put the sexuality in, it would just upset the whole question. And it would make it almost impossible for him, to deal with this situation. And I said, well, you seem to do it. The novel, when he submitted the novel to Berkeley Books, where he had a 3-book contract, the editor-in-chief had the manuscript, and Tom came in, and the editor-in-chief said, "This is not a science fiction novel," and he threw the manuscript at Tom, and all the pages went all over the floor, and Tom found himself having to pick the pages up off the floor and put them together. And when he told the story, he said, well, it made me figure I must have done something right. Just a year ago, less than a year ago, the Library of America, the people who do, the Philip Dick books, and one of the reasons, the Philip Dick books, do you know, are the most successful volumes in the Library of America series ever. They outsell all the other books in the Library of America, so much so that they have made the Library of America become interested in science fiction. So, 2 years ago, the Library of America decided to do a great science fiction novels from the 50s. And so they did a 2-volume anthology of four or five science fiction novels from the 50s, for 2 volumes of each. They then decided, because that 2-volume anthology did extremely well, maybe we should try great science fiction novels from the 60s. And so they asked the same person who had edited the first one, what are the science fiction novels that you want to put in this book? And he gave a list of 4 and 4. One of the novels from the end of the 60s was the late Thomas Dish's Camp Concentration. The Library of America looked over all of these and decided all of these things are probably okay. There is one we cannot print. Which one is it? Tell me. Camp Concentration by Thomas M. Dish. They are still, today, throwing the novel back at him, and everybody who hears this, who knows the science fiction from the 60s, says, they're not doing Camp Concentration? That's one of the most important novels from that decade. Why aren't they? Well, they're not doing it for the same reason they didn't, that he got the thing thrown. It had to be published originally in New Worlds in England. In another, if you look at the history is just repeating itself. And that's how these things work. The radical quality of the novel, it retains its radicalism in a way that's I think, pretty impressive. And I'm always surprised when that happens, and I think this is not really happening, is it? And then I realize, no, it is. And it's a very strange thing. It's so strange, I think it's time to talk about sex radicalism. Probably he would. Okay. I'm going to read you, to sort of close out the reading tonight, I'm going to read you a section from my 1988 autobiography, The Motion of Light in Water. It's in two sections, actually. The first one takes place when I was 10 years old and going for the first time to a new summer camp called Camp Woodland. And it was I have said many times, although I don't go into it here, if I am a human being today, one of the reasons is because I did go to a place like Woodland. But that's neither here. But it was also a very interesting place for other things. From The Motion of Light in Water. I'm 10 years old in Phoenicia, New York. Music was a hugely important ribbon weaving through our lives at Camp Woodland. That summer, I played the violin in the camp orchestra for a production of Herbert Hoffer's cantata, We Come from the City, about a bunch of young city people who arrived in the Catskills to work on the Downsville Dam. That same year, in the back of a pickup truck with a tape recorder, Norman Kasdan, and half a dozen other campers, I rode through the countryside to collect songs and stories from local folk shortly to be dispossessed from their neat homes by the Lackawack Reservoir, the leafy light over the gray porches and white-framed screen doors already suggesting the water that would soon cover their sights to a depth of 40 feet. Wrapped through the evening, gathered in the stone amphitheater behind the recreation hall, we sat forward on our rocky seats, while down on the concrete platform, a log fire burning at its edge, Pete Seeger flailed out the Cumberland Mountain Bear Chase on his banjo. At the final twanging chord, he flung his fingers down the strings so hard that two of his stainless finger picks flew off to spin, glittering among the first rows of listeners. At the same moment, a catch of water in the damp cement beneath the fire, burning an hour now, exploded like a gun crack, knocking over a log and sending cement bits clicking and furious sparks up 25 feet, swirling above Pete, turned to gape upward now, above the stage, above the trees, and into indigo evening. We all gasped, then applauded, and laughed. I knew I had come to a magic place. My second year at the 4th of July celebration on the ski slope down the hill across the Trestle Bridge over the rocky and frothing Esopus River, I watched our new music counselor, Bob DeCormier, stand before the counselors' chorus, crowded together with their music on the performance platform's planks. Knees together, thumbs and forefingers touching, Bob began to conduct out over campers and townspeople from Ellenville and Kingsville and Bearsville and Woodstock and Phoenicia who'd come together for America's birthday, they sang. The heart needs a brain and the brain needs a heart, and the whole is greater than any one part. That same summer, under his direction, the Campers Chorus premiered de Cormier's profound and lyric cantata about the life and sayings of Sojourner Truth. And in my third year, I sang and danced the lead in another Hofra cantata, Boney Quillen, based on a local legend about a logger who ate his girlfriend's flowers when she went off with another man, who tricked his bosses and danced out the nights and carried his axe through the Catskill mornings. That summer, my favorite counselor was a slender, light tan woman named Mary. She had a mannish voice, and when we were assigned our parts in the chorus, she was pronounced, to some surprise, a tenor, rather than soprano or alto. She sat next to me during chorus rehearsals all summer. Mary usually came to the Wednesday night social dances in jeans and short sleeves. When somebody made some comment and she finally consented to wear a skirt, I remember her as we stood by the wooden wall telling me, "I have a feeling I look very funny in this thing." She did. My family knew Mary's family, and on visiting day, when Mom and Dad came up, my father asked her, surprised, "Why in the world did you cut all your hair off like that, young lady?" Jocularly, Mary answered, "Oh, the last time I was at the barber's, I fell asleep in the chair. When I woke up, he'd just gone on cutting, and it was like this." It was a rehearsed answer for an untoward question. But both my parents looked sad. Still, Mary listened patiently, again and again, while we sat at the old upright in Brooklyn College, to my faltering, incomplete attempts that August to write my own cantata, and was even encouraging, which was more, I'm afraid, than the attempts deserved. All through the summer, professional musicians like Seeger and Louise Beavers came to make us music, and local musicians like Grant Richards sang to us about Bessie the heifer, the queen of all the cows, and aging Mike Todd played the harmonica and clacked his rhythmic rattling spoons in frantic chatter, stamping his boots while we listened fascinated. Then, in my fourth year, suddenly I was in the older woodland work camp further down the hill. Now, all the time, I was in and out of a building just up across the road, which I'd only glimpsed in previous years, called, beautifully and mystically, Butterfly Cottage. When I was 17, Uncle Miles and Aunt Dorothy came over one winter evening. My uncle's laughter and enthusiasm dwarfed everything and everybody in our house. "You gotta see this, Margaret. You're not gonna believe it. Sam," he meant my father, "it's right over there at the Apollo. They're female impersonators, but really, it's the cleverest thing you'll ever see." My mother's brother-in-law, Miles, a judge, was just not usually so boisterous about such things, at least not when I'd seen him before. "That's the Jewel Box Review," my mother said. "Yes, I'd read about it." "Men dressed up like women?" my cousin Barbara commented. "I think it sounds nasty. They're probably all fairies anyway." My aunt was saying, her voice undercutting her loud husband's, "You know, Margaret, the show in the first 10 rows of the theater was even stranger than what was going on stage." "I can believe it," Mother said to her older sister, Well, Uncle Miles shrugged. I don't know about that, but it's certainly entertaining. Everybody sings and dances in it. At the beginning, the master of ceremonies, this nice-looking young fellow named Stormy, he's colored too, I think, and with a real fine tenor voice, tells you that the company is made up of 25 men and 1 real woman. Then the impersonators come out and sing and dance and do their numbers. Some of them are good, too, not just because they look like women either, though some, I swear, nobody could tell. Then you're supposed to see if you can figure out which one is real. Oh, I thought it was the cleverest thing. He turned again to my father. And then, of course, at the end, it turns out, now, don't tell, Aunt Dorothy said. They might go see it. Oh, Uncle Miles laughed. Sam and Margaret aren't going to go see anything like that. But at the end, Stormy, the master of ceremonies, comes out and asks the audience, which of the performers do you think is the real girl? And while people are calling up this name or that, he laughed again, and everybody thinks they know it's this one or that one. Stormy pulls this thing that's been holding his hair back and shakes it out, and you realize she's been the real woman all along. And it's right there over at the Apollo. Now, that's not the usual sort of thing they have there, is it? My father asked. Is that what they're doing there now? I don't like to go there, Aunt Dorothy said. The jokes the comedians tell are always so dirty. The company travels around, I guess, Uncle Miles said. That's just where they're playing while they're in New York. My father said, now, why would they bring something like that there? No, Uncle Miles protested again, laughing. It's really good. I stood in the living room like someone grown invisible, wondering, puzzling that Uncle Miles, usually so staid, could grant his approval, even his enthusiastic approbation, to something so anarchic. At the same time, I yearned to see this transvestial extravaganza with a desire approaching the electric. Perhaps I would notice something, meet someone, recognize something in one of those strange people who'd clearly been marked as foreign and alien to everything I knew, that would in some way enlighten me about my own sexuality. I committed myself to seeing the show with the same desperation with which I had sought out Gide's Corydon and The Immoralist. Coming across me reading it behind a book at my desk back in my freshman English class, Mr. Cotter had begun to thunder, and what is it that's so important that you're reading it in here? And on recognizing the title and the Nobel Prize-winning author, returned to his normal conversational tone. Well, that probably is more important than anything I'm saying right now. You go on. The next Saturday, I strolled over to 125th Street and the fabled Harlem Theater, where regular movies alternated through the day and evening with live entertainment. This month's show, proclaimed the marquee, was indeed the Jewel Box Review. I paid the $5 for my ticket, half my month's allowance, went in and sat as close to the front of the orchestra as I dared, watching the last half hour of an unremarkable Western. The audience was mostly black, but a few white people had come, as though somehow this particular show transcended parochial racial interests. At the film's end, the lights came up on the stage, the first curtain swept back, and in purple sequins, a middle-aged black woman comic came out to regale the audience with a barrage of jokes far more sexually suggestive than I would have thought it was legal to tell from a public stage. Toward the end of her routine, which, vulgar as it was very funny, the orchestra players filed into the small pit. Then the music crashed up and out, another curtain swung back, and an amplified voice announced to the multiple balconies in the dark, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, what you've all been waiting for, the fabulous Jewel Box Review." Why double my uncle's description with accounts of the glitter and feathers and sweeping trains in which the female impersonators danced with their male partners, a maleness suddenly thrust into quotation marks by the fake breasts, cinch waists, and wigs around it? For here, all masculinity seemed as questionable as any femininity on show. Betuxed and black-tied, Stormy introduced Mr. Alberto Pavlova, who, in tutu, toe shoes, and silver wig, began to dance the dying swan, only to break into something hot and kicky with a sudden lurch of the music toward jazz. Now, from the other side of the stage, Stormy introduced Mr. Georgie Brown, a hefty black transvestite who, in wig and high heels, with inch-long crimson nails, clutched a bit of sequined gauze to his padded bosom and sang day in, day out in a volcanic contralto that laid chills all down my shoulder blades. Once or twice, someone in the first row ran to the footlights to hand a bouquet of roses up to one or another of the stately queens, and at the end, Stormy pulled loose her hair to let it fall over the tux's satin collar as the whole company came out to sing, "We're 25 men and a girl." Yet, as the curtain finally swept across the tinsel, plumes, and lame, and the house lights came up briefly before the movie began again, there seemed no way for me to break through the doubled and redoubled artificiality of this entertainment that had just made me laugh and thrill and madly applaud its falsifications, this one artful, that one pathetic, yet all insisting on the entire range of artifice that was art. It was dark in the street when, hands in my army jacket pockets, I strolled from under the bright marquee to walk back home. I never even mentioned to anyone in my family that I'd gone. It was some years later, when the Jewel Box had again made its annual swing through the Northeast, coming to light at the Apollo, that I overheard my mom and a downstairs neighbor talking in our kitchen. Certainly I was curious, but, well, I couldn't have gone to see it, Mom said, putting down her coffee cup. You know how her mother feels about it. Really, she never would have spoken to me again if she'd found out. Now, that's the one I read about who plays the Master of Ceremonies. The neighbor's voice both repeated and confirmed at once. The one they called Stormy? Yes, that's Mary, who used to be a counselor up with Sam and Peggy at camp about 6 or 7 years ago. My mother nodded. That's right. And for a moment, and only a moment, it was as if a gap between two absolute and unquestionably separated columns or encampments of the world had suddenly revealed itself as illusory, that what I had assumed two was really one, and that the glacial solidity of the boundary I'd been sure existed between them was as permeable as shimmering water, as shifting light. Thank you. Thank you very much.